Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer,
I'm Krista Carmen,
and this is
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and Gentlemen. We are so excited to have esteemed historian and author Michael Wolraich on the show today to discuss his new book, The Bishop and the Butterfly: Murder, Politics, and the End of the Jazz Age. Almost 93 years ago to the day, the enigmatic Vivian Gordon met a tragic end, strangled with a piece of clothesline and left in a desolate Bronx park. With ties to gangsters, booze, prostitution, loan sharking, racketeering, bank robbers, and blackmail schemes, her murder led to the downfall of Tammany Hall, a political behemoth that had stood for over a century and culminated in the resignation of the mayor of New York City himself. The narrative unfolds with all the elements of a riveting story: sex, bootleggers, and larger-than-life characters with names like Chowderhead, Greenie, and Doc, all against a backdrop of deep historical significance. Welcome, Michael. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining our show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor. Happy to be here.
Yes, I want to extend that welcome and I want to get right into it. And I think the best way to convey the story to the listeners would be if you wouldn't mind telling us all who the Bishop and the Butterfly from your book's title are and what they stand for.
Sure. Well, let's start with the butterfly, Vivian Gordon, who Matthew already introduced. She's the butterfly because she was known as a Broadway butterfly. She had been an actor, but Broadway at that time was, that was a place where all the kind of cool, hip people hung out. A lot of criminals hung out. And so a Broadway butterfly was somebody who was in that milieu, which she very much was. She would frequent all the nightclubs and the speakeasies to pick up men generally. She would seduce men, and sometimes they'd have an affair, and he would give her gifts, and she made money that way. So she was a gold digger in that way, as they called it. But she would also, especially after the affair, she might blackmail the guy to squeeze as much out of him as she could. And it wasn't just her. She as she became more successful in this business, she recruited a team of young women, whom she called her young 49ers, as in gold miners. And she would instruct them on how to, how do you meet these men? How do you get information on them? What do you do with that information once you have it? So she had all these schemes for fleecing wealthy New Yorkers who were and visitors from other cities who would come to Broadway to experience life in the Roaring Twenties. She had other schemes, as Matthew mentioned. She had financial fraud schemes. She loaned money to gangsters. She invested in a bank robbery in Oslo, Norway, of all places. So she had a number of illicit ways of making money, and made quite a bit. She invested, I think, about almost $100,000 worth of real estate, which was quite a lot in those days. And so lived the high life. The bishop refers to a man named Samuel Seabury, who Hamilton fans might recognize the name because it was his great grandfather. Samuel Seabury was the same name, the first Episcopalian bishop in the United States. And he tangled with Hamilton back during the Revolutionary era. So the Samuel Seabury that I'm writing about he was not a theologian. He came from a long line of clergymen, but he was a lawyer and a judge, and he was but he had that air. He had that kind of self-righteous, air of his ancestors, and was always, dressed immaculately and, hair combed, clean shaven, never swore. He was, just this very upright but pompous guy. And so people called him behind his back, they called him the bishop, partly a reference to his illustrious ancestor, and partly, mocking his manner.
Hmm. Very fascinating, and I love the title. Can we go back just a teeny bit to the butterfly because is so did all of those schemes and things that she did that you mentioned, were all of those things that occurred after she lost her daughter? Or so can you talk a little bit how that first arrest for prostitution and how you think that uh affected things going forward?
Absolutely, yeah. It was a tragic story. She had been she'd been an actor when she was younger, and then got married and had a daughter. She married a man named John Bischoff, and her name was actually not Vivian Gordon. That was an alias that she adopted later. So her married name was Benita Bischoff, and her daughter was also named Benita. And they settled down in Philadelphia, and Vivian, or everyone called her Vivian. So I'll continue, even though she was known as Benita at this time. She loved her, she adored her daughter, who was, a very talented dancer and actually performed on the stage in Philadelphia. And around the time she was 8, she and her husband were fighting a lot. They were on the rocks, and one of the things they were fighting about was their daughter. And Vivian Gordon wanted to take Benita to New York and try out for like the big Broadway shows, and he was against it. So eventually they separated, and she did take her daughter to New York and was living there. And then an incident happened that changed her life forever. She was arrested by a vice cop. His name was Andrew McLaughlin, very handsome vice cop on the force, known for picking up a lot of prostitutes. And he arrested her. They went down to the women's court, which was it was a special court for women in what's in Greenwich Village. Uh, it was, it was a big scene, actually. Like men around New York would come, and especially for the night court sessions, just to ogle the prostitutes getting arrested. Uh, and she was arrested and advised by her lawyer to plead guilty, which she did. And then, despite the fact that that she pled guilty, that this was her first offense, that she had this 8-year-old daughter, the judge, instead of putting her on parole, sentenced her to a reformatory upstate, known as Bedford. Um, meant to reform, young women who had gone astray. And so she went up there, and it was an awful place, like despite what it was supposed to be. And instead of reforming her, it did the opposite. There were, a lot of other women there who kind of taught her, women who had been prostitutes, and other criminals who taught her essentially how to make money, um, in New York City during the Roaring Twenties. At the same time, she was branded. She was now seen as a prostitute, so it really made it difficult to get legitimate work at that point. And then, worst of all, she lost her daughter. Her husband sued for divorce, got full custody of her daughter, and she was never allowed to see her anymore after that. No contact. So she was bitter. She was devastated. She was angry, and she turned to a life of crime. She adopted this new alias, Vivian Gordon, and it sort of gave her this new identity. And started at first just as kind of a high-end prostitute, and then gradually added more and more schemes, and even became a madam herself, where she was running a call girl service, um, in the 1920s.
And so one more question about that. So, because you said this changed her and she was bitter and she adopted this life of crime after going up to the reformatory. what are your thoughts on whether that initial arrest for prostitution was warranted or not? I know there was a whole kind of scheme that went along with that as well.
Yes, I left out a very important part of this story, which is that after her conviction, she told her parole officer that she believed that her husband, John Bishop, had conspired with the vice cop, Andrew McLaughlin, to set her up.
Mm.
She claimed that she was innocent, that she'd only pleaded guilty on her lawyer's advice, that she had, and certainly, she had no record before then. She wasn't, she'd been, she was a mom. Um, the so she made this claim, but nobody really paid any attention to it. But all this time, as she years as she developed this criminal career, she still harbored these um, feelings of anger and vengeance, and hoped to find a way to get her daughter back and to make the vice cop and her husband pay for what they'd done to her, which had really destroyed her life.
It's like her villain origin story. It's just crazy. Yes, thank you for going into that a little bit more because I found that a really fascinating part of the story.
Do we want to say anything about FDR? How many people knew that he couldn't walk? Like, was it well known, or I mean, it's just crazy to me that they were able to keep that a secret.
Yeah, I mean, it was known, it's certainly known in certain circles, but they kept that information from the public. And I mean, I write about in the book about when he's, after his first public emergence, after he's been crippled, and walking, up. This is at the Democratic Convention, and walking with his son kind of by his side, holding his arm. He would work for hours and hours to train himself to walk, which he wasn't really walking. He was kind of sliding his feet forward by and leaning on something, but it was able to create enough of an impression, back when you didn't have, where newsreels weren't that common, that people felt like he was able to do it. And then he would stand there and lecture on the, just hold onto the lectern with like white knuckled, keeping himself upright. So it's really kind of amazing what he went through to hide this handicap that he had, and amazing that more people weren't aware of it.
Were his political rivals were aware of it, were they not, or weren't they?
Oh, yeah, certainly they were, but
Because in
it was,
today's day and age, he would
yeah,
get
that would have been completely exploited. Yeah, no,
his
here,
honor
like
back then, huh?
yeah, it would have been disrespectful for them to, bring that up, and try to. I mean, they would sometimes try to make the case in subtle ways. So, and his defenders would also, they would talk about how strong he was to,
Hmm.
kind of cover, respond to those insinuations. So it did exist, but certainly not, now it would be just explicit. But it also wouldn't be seen, having a disability would not be seen as a problem politically. We've had,
Right.
we've had no, not presidents, but senators, certainly the prominent senators with disabilities, and it can often, especially if it's like a war injury, can be a political advantage.
Mhm.
Um, but at that time, it was perceived as being a sign of weakness.
There's just so many crazy, awesome characters in this book. One of them that kind of stood out to me, John Radeloff, who was her lover, and he came from a good family, a prominent background. He'd become a lawyer like his father, and he was married, but he somehow fell into this life of crime there in New York City and got himself tangled up in all kinds of stuff. Were a lot of people like of prominent background just kind of drawn to that? And like maybe you could tell us a little bit more about him and what he represented.
Sure. Well, I mean, just some background first. So when they found her body and identified her, and they went to her apartment in the wealthy neighborhood of Murray Hill, in Manhattan, they found a bunch of diaries. Uh, they were date books really, but she used them as diaries and wrote down some things about her business and some things about what was happening to her in her life. And she talked a lot about this guy, John A. Radloff, who and described him as being very dangerous and as having threatened her life on multiple occasions. Uh, so this guy had no criminal record. He was a respectable lawyer. His father had immigrated from Russia and had built a prosperous business in Brooklyn. Um, the but he was entangled with a lot of illicit activities. He wasn't. He helped. First of all, he helped Vivian Gordon develop her business operations. So when she would blackmail somebody, he would represent her, go to the blackmail target, and give them the ultimatum, and collect the money from them. He also helped her manage some of her other businesses. He was the one who connected her with that bank robbery in Norway, attempted bank robbery in Norway. Um, so yeah, he just, he liked money. He spent it as soon as he got it. He liked women. He had a lot of affairs. And he did this all, underneath this veneer of respectability, which, I mean, it happens in every age, but it was particularly common in the 1920s because this was prohibition. This was, first of all, the economy was booming, so there was a lot of money, and the prohibition created a lot of opportunities for crime, and crime even became cool. Like, normal people would go to these nightclubs where these notorious gangsters and bootleggers hung out, or even owned the nightclubs a lot of times. But rich, respectable people would go there, kind of slumming it, and party. So there was a lot, that line between respectability and crime really faded during this era, and a lot more people crossed over. I talk about, uh, in the book, Joseph Crater, who was this New York judge who mysteriously disappeared one day, and his murder is unsolved to this day. And he was this very respectable judge in New York, and you know walked off one day, was never seen again. And then they found out that he had all these mistresses and he had all these gangster connections. So this was not that uncommon.
Yeah. And then we have this crazy mayor, Jimmy Walker. Um, they called him the Nightmare, huh? He was a character, huh?
And the
Yeah,
Nightmare is such a good name. Like, that's just phenomenal.
it's yeah, he really was. Yeah, our current mayor, Eric Adams, calls himself the nightlife mayor. And there are some similarities, but that doesn't quite have the same ring as nightmare. Um, or the same double connotation. So, but Jimmy Walker, he was New York's Playboy mayor. He dressed up, in these, gorgeous suits. He had a personal tailor who designed his suits and helped him, plan his ensemble. He would change 3 times a day, in the morning, during work hours, and then after work to go out to party. And he was particularly known for partying. He would go to Broadway with his mistress on his arm, who was a Broadway star half his age. Her name was Betty Compton. And he didn't try to hide it. This was his image. This was what everyone knew all about it, and they loved him for it because, again, this was the Roaring Twenties, and everyone was having fun, and he embodied that the hedonism and the excess of the era. So he was elected in 1925, and then we ran for re-election in 1929. He was challenged by a congressman, Fiorello LaGuardia, whose name is now famous because there's an airport named after him. But Walker crushed him. LaGuardia was like, look, this guy is not on the up and up. This guy has criminal connections. His administration is they're consorting with gangsters. He's living beyond his means clearly, and he would LaGuardia made all these allegations, but no one paid much attention at that time in 1929.
I love the way when he was in California, he would come out in like silk pajamas with like polka dots on them.
Yeah, he gave a bunch of interviews. He for his health, he went out to Palm Springs and lived on this stayed on this ranch of a wealthy friend of his. Go out and take sun baths, as they called him, every day. And so he'd give interviews. The press loved him, so, and they'd be there every day, and he'd give interviews in his pajamas and these polka dotted purple pajamas. At some point, some of his people from Tammany Hall that you had mentioned before from that political machine kind of got word to him that maybe this is not such a good look for him, that he needs to be a little more serious, especially as these allegations against him continued to mount.
Hugh Hefner before his time or something.
Polka dot pajamas. The details you find out when you're a historian researching and you are a historian, and this is a very historical book about New York politics and the 20s and 30s and Franklin Roosevelt's rise to the presidency. But you framed the narrative in the guise of true crime, and obviously Matthew and I do a true crime podcast, so we were very interested in this, and you centered it around the mysterious murder of Vivian Gordon, like we talked about. Can you tell us about your process and what drew you to write this from a true crime perspective as opposed to just like a straight nonfiction, or how you came about writing the book in this form?
Sure. I mean, I'm not an academic historian. I write, but I've written. This would be my third history book, or book with at least with history in it. I was looking for, when you're writing about history for a popular audience, you need to pick, like big names that people know, as opposed to obscure people. But a lot of those people have been written about to death. And so, FDR being one example. Putting out another book about FDR is not, is going to be challenging. So I was looking into his time as governor, because everyone knows about his time, everyone knows about his presidency, but not much about the 4 years he was governor of New York. And as I was kind of digging into this, I started digging into these investigations that he initiated that were led by the Judge Samuel Seabury, the bishop from the title. And I came across this, one reference to this murder of Vivian Gordon. And I started digging into that, and it was fascinating. I mean, I learned first of all, just the murder itself, just on a human level and on a suspense level, was fascinating, because there were so many twists and turns that tried to solve this mystery. But it was also much more important than anyone seemed to have remembered. The sensation, her murder was so sensational, and she was connected in a way to those Seabury investigations, and that really created all this political pressure on FDR to expand the investigations and to confront Tammany Hall, which he had been really hesitant to do. So here he had the story that was like just this great story, and also an important part of history. And so I was like, I got to tell the story. And so the approach I took, modeled after a bit after Devil in the White City, which has these two narratives. Like, one story is the crime story, the serial killer. The other story is the World's Fair and the architect behind the World's Fair. And my stories are actually much more connected. These were just connected in the sense that they occurred in the same place at the same time. But it was brilliant because, I mean, in my opinion, actually the World's Fair story is actually even more interesting, but nobody would have read it if he'd pushed this story about an architect. And so you have the kind of the suspenseful serial killer and the investigation on one side, kind of drawing you through the book as you're also following along the development of the World's Fair. So I took the same approach with this book. There are two threads. One thread is Vivian Gordon's murder and the investigation, And then the other thread is the Samuel Seabury's investigation of Tammany Hall and of the mayor that had such a transformational effect on New York City's history.
Yeah, I love The Devil in the White City, but yours feels more organic, like the way the two stories flow together. His is very like almost like an outline, going back and forth. But that's interesting.
That Yeah, yeah,
And
thanks. Yeah, I think that's mainly. I mean, he's a Larson's a terrific writer. I think it mainly has to do with the fact that those stories were actually like completely discrete stories, whereas
right,
mine
right.
they're interwoven. I mean, so we hadn't mentioned, but what made the story so sensational was that 5 days before her murder, Vivian Gordon had met with Samuel Seabury's investigation team. And she'd met with them because she wanted to tell her story about how she was framed by her husband and that vice cop. And indeed, Samuel Seabury had found that the cops who were in the vice squad who were arresting women for prostitution were many of them were crooked. I mean,
Mhm.
this guy Andrew McLaughlin, who arrested Vivian Gordon, lived in this fancy apartment with all these beautiful furnishings and took these luxurious vacations, and clearly was living a life beyond the salary of a cop in New York City. And Samuel Seabury, determined that there was indeed a conspiracy at the women's court where the cops would arrest innocent women uh, and bring them to court and kind of steer them to these corrupt lawyers. And those lawyers, those defense attorneys, would collect huge sums from the women if they could afford it, and then give kickbacks to the cops. And then, so, if you paid the lawyer's fee, then the lawyer would arrange for the cop not to show up, or the lawyer might, or the defense lawyer might give a bribe to the prosecutor, and the woman would get off, and all these people would make money. In the case, if the women couldn't afford the fee, as it happened with Vivian Gordon, then they were screwed. Then they were convicted and sent to the reformatory. So that's the place, this women's court, where Vivian Gordon was arrested, where Samuel Seabury found this conspiracy. That's the nexus where these two stories came together in a significant way.
It's crazy.
Yeah,
And
it's real. I mean, kudos to you for recognizing what an amazing like story this whole thing and the way you pieced it together was just really wonderful. And I mean, a fascinating time period in and of itself between two world wars and the overlap of Prohibition and the Great Depression. Um, I guess, did we cover this all? I know you talked a little bit about what was the very first thing that drew you to this story? Was there like one piece of it, or was it the setting, or was it the time era? What was the very first thing that found you on this path to writing this book?
Well, it was this yeah, the unexplored era of FDR as governor,
Okay, so that was
which
the
I
first
mean,
thing that you
yeah,
were
yeah, which
interested
I mean,
in?
there's a reason it's not well explored, because he was not actually didn't do a lot and was not very
Mm,
interesting in and of itself as governor. But there were all these things going on in New York City that were extremely interesting, and they actually played a role in his, because he was already planning to run for president, and he really
right.
didn't want to confront Tammany Hall, because he needed their support to get the Democratic nomination, because they were so powerful, not only in New York City and New York State, but also in U.S. politics in general. So yeah, it ended up being this space that kind of no one really expected to have as much going on as it did.
Yes,
yeah,
that's very cool.
something I found interesting is that post this story, when LaGuardia finally became mayor of New York City, he's a Republican and FDR is a Democrat, but they worked together very happily and like accomplished so much, which I really think the world should look at today to see when the two parties can come together, how much they can do when they don't hate each other. But
Yeah, I mean, it was, we have, we've had things like that, like Mayor Bloomberg when he first ran in his first term ran as a Republican. It's a little bit being a Republican in New York City, especially as a mayor, has always been a little different from what it means at the national level. But
Mhm.
it was also a different era. I mean, there were actually a lot of very liberal and progressive Republicans at that time, and LaGuardia was one of them. Unfortunately, we're so divided and so polarized that you very rarely see that kind of interaction and cooperation.
Right. I'm just so fascinated by the depth of historical information in this book. And it's like just so meticulously endnoted, footnoted. How do you go about writing something like this? Like, because I see you in the basement of a dreary library or in these historical societies searching through dusty archives. And is that what it's like? Or are you able to use the internet for most of your work these days?
I mean, it is both. I definitely was able to use the internet for a lot, and I got a lot of the detail that like helps me make this a narrative and not just like a dry history came actually from newspapers,
Mhm.
particularly like the Daily News, which is just all over this crime. And I write about one of the characters that I write about was a Daily News reporter named Grace Robinson, a crime reporter, who was just this, she was a pioneer female journalist, and just an excellent reporter and a great writer. Um, and those are all digitized, so I was, able to get all
Nice.
those. I was spending, we have various archives in New York City, and there wasn't actually as much as I'd hoped about this case in those. I was particularly spent time in the Bronx courthouse has an archive, and just it's completely disorganized. And so I was digging there. There was a dusty room where I was digging through files. So
Nice.
I did have that as well.
I'm a big fan of like old time vernacular. And you have this quote in your book from Abel Green in Variety magazine about Times Square. And I wanted to go over it with you, but first I'll just give the quote. Like, every gimmick imaginable goes on the big street, from fake auction rooms to shell game, dame baited speaks operating openly, creepers and badger workers with improv methods, undercover rendezvous of intermediate sex, luring Freudian students and everything else. So, like, I don't understand a lot of that. Maybe you can explain some of that. Fake auction rooms is it just a fake auction, or
Uh, I'm not, I believe that is, yeah, that they were selling like fake art pieces, for
fake art, fake
example.
antiques and stuff?
So I'm less familiar with that. I mean, the shell game was a popular con. You probably, where like, the people would be, guess,
Cups and
where the
balls.
bead is under the shell.
Yeah.
And, it was pretty common, and people actually lost a fair amount of money that way, or made a fair amount of money. Um, the Freudian bit was an allusion to homosexuality,
That's what I was
without
wondering. Is that what that is?
yeah.
Yeah. Dame baited
The
speaks. That's obviously just a woman trying to lure someone into a speakeasy.
Yep.
Creepers and badger workers. What the hell is that?
Uh
Cops and robbers, maybe?
Creepers, I don't know. No, yeah, and I knew Badger Workers, but it's escaping me now. So
I love
Yeah, I
all
mean,
that
it's
stuff. I
quite that
love it.
that whole quote is like quite the
yeah.
mouthful and quite the thing to wrap your head around for sure.
Yeah, the whole original, I kind of took some snippets of it, but the whole article is even longer. It was fun to read. I like just he was literary, right? He was writing for a magazine. I like the quotes that the newspapers would pick up just from the various gangsters, and just like the way they talked. And it's great to all the quotes in my book, it's nonfiction. They're all sourced, and they were all things that people said
Meticulously
to
sourced with
journalists.
endnotes. Yeah.
So I want to go back a little bit to something that we talked about before. Many people have heard of the butterfly effect, how the flap of a butterfly's wing in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas, and it does seem to apply to our butterfly here as well. And that there was a tornado of change that resulted from from her death. But and I even took it back a little bit further with like, you just think, to me, a huge portion of this story, like so much of it rested for me on what happened to her with her daughter. And I just wonder, like, if, she hadn't had such a bad relationship with her husband and things hadn't ended so poorly, and if he really had set her up, if like that hadn't started that whole chain of events, and then, to take it even further than that, do you think the murderers and those who set her up, further down the line could have had any idea just how big this case would become, and how it would change the city of New York?
Yeah, no one had any idea. Certainly the murderers, they were, working within their own, sphere and had their own issues. I mean, they knew, they knew that she had talked to the Seabury Commission.
Mm.
So, they knew there was, they were worried about her kind of going public with some of her secrets, but no, they had no sense that, by killing her, they would actually, create this explosion in the media and, this change. I don't think anybody anticipated that. And I don't even think anybody, even right after the murder. I mean, the paper, it was like a couple months later, as the case was dragging on and still not solved, and all of a sudden, the Seabury investigation started ramping up, and the papers were just marveling about how this seemingly unrelated murder had, created this change that had become this catalyst for for this huge change. It was amazing, and it's kind of a shame that that's been that part of it has been forgotten
Mm.
in the history. There's histories of the Seabury investigation and of Jimmy Walker, but the role of Vivian Gordon murder has been lost.
Mm.
It really is a butterfly effect if you think about it. It's cool that she was a Broadway butterfly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great point. Actually, that wasn't planned as part of the title, but I love it.
Um, the Roaring Twenties. It's so interesting to me that it was believed alcohol prohibition would decrease crime, vice, and sin, but instead it had the complete opposite effect. It gave all these gangsters so much power and money, creating jazz clubs, speakeasies, theaters, brothels. You say it inspired people to, quote, indulge in vice as a creative act of defiance, which I absolutely love. I love that quote. I've actually indulged in vice as a creative act of defiance myself. Do you want to maybe give us a little more perspective on all that?
Thanks. No, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, it was. This was before the 1920s. It was still Victorian era. People dressed
Mm-hmm.
in petticoats and
Top
high
hats.
buttons, and the uh, in this era, when this prohibition, which was particularly unpopular in places like New York, it came, we had this huge Irish population here, and it was that a lot of people were very bitter and angry about prohibition, and so they simply defied it, and that defiance, gave them, license to create defiance in other ways as well, and in what they wore, in who and how much sex they had, the in how they cut their hair. The women cut their bobbed their hair.
Mm-hmm.
They wore short skirts. They partied all night with gangsters, as we talked about. So it was like as if they'd been living this kind of cloistered, restricted existence for decades, and just in the act of defying prohibition, kind of threw off the bounds of the cultural restrictions. And so as a result, you also had a creative evolution of people like Fitzgerald, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you had the Harlem Renaissance, where black authors and artists and performers were so creative and able to kind of actually bring what they had to offer to the white New Yorkers and the white world who hadn't even experienced that before. So you just had a lot of amazing things going on in this era, but also came with a lot of crime, and so that was you had this kind of freedom, but it also gave license to these criminals and these corrupt cops, and so that was like the other side of this coin.
Yeah, it kind of going along with like the, sin and abiding by prohibition versus not and the just craziness of the time. So when Matthew and I were discussing the book, we were kind of just talking about everything randomly and picking up on things that had stood out to us. And one thing that we talked about was how people in the book were able to tear through so much money. They were making money hand over fist, but losing it just as fast, Vivian in particular. Um, where did all that money go? Was it bad investments, crazy nightlife? Matthew and I were trying to like hypothesize on that.
Well, certainly there were a lot of spendthrifts. Vivian Gordon was actually pretty good with her money. She was, she was careful with it. Her boyfriend John Radloff, not so much, and
Yeah,
he
those.
manipulated her and preyed on her, and was responsible actually for a lot of her losses
Mm.
by trying to get her involved in these schemes. Um, so, he was certainly a spendthrift, and there were a lot of those. But really, it was the stock market crash that
Okay.
that just destroyed everything, because first of all, people had all these investments that became worthless. That happened to Vivian Gordon. She had a bunch of stocks that became
Mm.
worthless. But it also like dried up. People lost their. A lot of people were out of work, and in Vivian Gordon's case, it like dried up the money coming in. She didn't no longer had all these spendthrift men that she could, you know, exploit and prey upon for their money, and so she, suddenly didn't have money coming in.
But for some reason, the obsession and fascination with true crime, it's often considered a modern phenomenon, but it was always immensely popular, which you point out in your book, describing how newspapers, which you just mentioned, like the Daily News, they basically existed off of sensational crime stories. And I was curious, how do you think the public's appetite for true crime compares today to back then, and what kind of shifts do you see in the true crime fascination dynamics?
That's an interesting question. I mean, yeah, certainly like novels, certainly like books about true crime, were not around. I mean, I really like Truman Capote, I think made that a
Right.
thing decades ago, and since then, it's become a big book genre. It certainly wasn't a book genre at that time, but yeah, on the flip side, certain newspapers in particular really covered that. And that was really the bread and butter, as you said, of Daily News and the other tabloids. So Daily News was the country's first tabloid. They copied it. There was one in London, and they copied the model, where the papers were half size,
Mhm.
tabloid size. That's why they're called tabloids. They were
Oh, is
full of.
it? I didn't realize that. That
Yep.
is interesting.
So they were, kind of easier to read and to hold on the subway, and they cost less, and they had a bunch of pictures, and they were written in this very kind of accessible language, meant, more for working class than for rich folks. Uh, and so, crime and sex were, they were all about that. That's how they sold copy, and that's how Daily News quickly became the biggest newspaper in the country,
Mm.
by focusing on that. And then, of course, a bunch of other tabloids sprang up and followed that model. And Daily News still exists. It's been a little bit passed by other tabloids, but we still have that model uh, today. But it's less crime focused, and I think that interest in crime has been taken up in books, and of course in podcasts such as this. I mean, the podcast has been obviously been huge, really changed how we learn about and how we think about true crime.
Yes, yes. I love that answer. And it's so that's very, I don't think I knew that about the tabloid either. It sounds like vaguely familiar. Maybe I'd heard it at one point. Yeah, we also wanted to ask, we know you grew up in Iowa, but you've been living in New York City for 24 years, and that's a
Yep.
pretty big difference between those two places. What is it about New York that you fell in love with that made you stay?
You know, I for me, places for me are like people. Like sometimes, you meet somebody and you just connect with them instantly. And you don't, it's not even necessarily about, what their attributes are. It's not about, it's just you just like there's something that you just connect with. And I've had the same thing with places. I find if I connect with a place, I will always love it. And if I don't connect, I will never love it.
Hmm.
Um, I lived in San Francisco for a couple of years, and I mean, it's a wonderful city. I had nothing concrete. There were many amazing things about it. It just wasn't for me. It just didn't feel
Mhm.
right. Whereas New York just always did. Whenever long before I moved here, when I visited, I do remember kind of the moment that before I moved that I fell in love with the place and wanted to move was there was I was visiting a cousin and walking. I had some time, so I was walking through Central Park, and there was like this late spring snow, this really sticky cotton candy snow, like
Mm.
in all the trees, and walking through. There's a place in Central Park called the Ramble, which is like forest-like, and just walking through this beautiful place with like this cotton candy snow all over the trees. It was just amazing. And then you can see like the skyscrapers in the distance. So I love that. I love the energy of the place. I love how it's always open. I love how
Yes.
there's so much going on here. It's frankly, I've got a daughter now, and it's great for kids too. There's like so many activities, and so many other kids around. I love it here.
You obviously love
Oh,
the history as well.
Yeah, no, that was been one of the treats to writing this book is really kind of digging into New York City's history and how we got there, especially like at this moment, which is probably one of the most interesting points in New York City's history. I mean, the Roaring Twenties, even aside from the politics that was going on, just that era in New York it's uh one of a kind.
Nice.
it's a great answer. I can so visualize the cotton candy snow in the trees. It's lovely.
You got any new projects coming up? Anything you're working on now?
Not yet. With me when I like it takes me a while to kind of withdraw from the book, and like it hasn't, we haven't hit the pub date yet, and so I'm
Right.
involved in promotion and doing interviews and that sort of thing. So I think in a few months I'll start to breathe in, start kind of thinking about what I want to do. I mean, I I definitely want to be writing narrative history, more narrative history. Um, possibly but not necessarily with true crime. I do want it to be something suspenseful where you're really telling the story that brings readers along. So I mean, true crime is definitely a good way to do that. So if I find the right crime, uh the I'll do that again.
That's the thing
I
about true crime. There's so many of them. There's so many goddamn crimes out there. You can never run out.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's for
exactly.
sure.
Yeah, so I have more information about the book on my website, which is my name, Michael Wolraich, WOLRAICH.com. I've got information about the book, some photos, my events are listed there, and there are links to buy the book.
Are there more photos from just in the book in there?
The ones that the ones that I have there, I haven't put that many in. I think I'll add more. There are a couple that weren't in the book.
I'm gonna check that out for sure because it's like those characters are so fascinating. I love seeing their faces.
Yeah, I'm so glad they put photos into the book because this is my first book that we've done with photos, and my editor just did a great job of selecting those and curating those. So it's
There's some
really, I
great
think,
ones in
adds
there.
to it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, the book is The Bishop and the Butterfly: Murder, Politics, and the End of the Jazz Age. The author is Michael Wolraich. It goes on sale everywhere you get fine books on February 6th. Get yourself a copy. It's fantastic. fun, educational. I'll put links in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on again.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it, and it was great. It was great talking to both of you.
Thank you.
As always, drop us a line and say hi at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you Wednesday. Bye.